Welcome to the Road Ahead podcast. I'm Ray Ghanbari, Chief Technology Officer at Omnitracs. I'll be your host for this ongoing series of podcasts that will bring you a myriad of professionals, both from inside and outside the transportation industry. My hope is that these conversations will be helpful to you as you're considering ideas and innovations that could transform your fleet financially, operationally, and safely. I hope you find these brief conversations thought-provoking and rewarding. I look forward to discussing ideas and topics that are outside our normal day-to-day, and we welcome your feedback. In today's podcast, we're discussing cybersecurity. What is cybersecurity? Why does it matter? And what should you be doing to protect your businesses and your fleets? Joining us again are Homaira Akbari, President and CEO of AKnowledge Partners, a global strategy and advisory firm, and Steve Weber, Faculty Director for the Center of Long Term Cybersecurity at the University of California, Berkeley. Welcome, Homaira and Steve, and thank you for joining us today. Cybersecurity is such an important and broad topic, impacting so much of our personal and business lives, from enterprise security to consumer to Internet of Things, among others. Steve, to get us started, can you help us understand what is cybersecurity? How should we think about it? And maybe share some examples of how cybersecurity applies to the transportation industry.
Thanks, Ray. It's a great question because the issues of cybersecurity around us every day, and sometimes it makes sense to take a step back and say, what are we actually dealing with here? So at the very, very basic level, people usually use the acronym CIA, which in this case stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And all of those things apply to information. So if you have confidential, integral, and available information, that's a secure system. A secure system has all of those three things all the time. So unsurprisingly, if attackers are trying to take advantage of you in some way, they're going to attack or target at least one and possibly more of those three characteristics. So, for example, confidentiality. An attacker will engage in a data breach or try to sell your data. Integrity. This is about data manipulation, adversarial attacks on machine learning systems or changing data sets. The kind of natural, fearful reaction people, what if someone were to randomize all my bank account data and I get a different balance every time I log in? And of course, the one that is in everyone's mind these days because of its prevalence in the news is ransomware, which is really an attack on availability. Going to lock up your data so you can't use it. That's what it's really about. And in fact, if you want to go to kind of worse scenarios, people usually think about attacks on more than one of those characteristics at exactly the same time. So for example, availability and integrity together, you may be able to unlock a ransomware attack, but you find out that in the interim, your data has been manipulated. So that's basically the landscape that we're operating on. Now, let me kind of map that onto enterprise and IoT security as two different kinds of problems that organizations are trying to solve. The conventional wisdom, I think, these days is that the boundaries of the enterprise in the digital layer are really quite fuzzy. There are no moats. There are no firm walls around the organization. And that conventional wisdom is right. In fact, inside and outside the enterprise are becoming really, really hard distinctions to maintain. Let me just do an example. I live here in the Bay Area. The regional transportation system here is called BART. And if you think about enterprise security for an organization like BART, BART has a headquarters here in Oakland. They're running a massive enterprise digital layer, of course, in a relatively managed environment. They've got finance systems, scheduling, maintenance oversight, human resources, et cetera, et cetera. And think about what's happening around that piece of the puzzle. Employees badge in the building as they go to work. They authenticate on what are probably BART issued computers. They use an internal wireless network with its own specific security provisions. So that's a relatively managed environment, and it's still vulnerable. Out on the edge, on the IoT, you have the endpoints of that network, say sensors in the BART trains, sensors on the train tracks, weather sensors, parking lot cameras, fee turnstiles, and actuators, rail switches, lights, public awareness announcements and stuff like that. All of these things are sort of connected to each other, and they're all vulnerabilities that can be attacked in different ways. And I think just to kind of wrap it together, this is a huge and really amazingly heterogeneous attack surface. Nobody has 360-degree visibility over what connects to what and where the endpoints really are. So I think to kind of sum it up, the enterprise IoT distinction doesn't really matter so much anymore. The enterprise is out there in the IoT, and the IoT is in there in the enterprise. A train driver is using her iPhone to access a trouble ticket system in the ERM. I'm using my iPad to check the schedule on the weekend. The two things are interlinked intimately. So the moral of the story is IoT is enterprise, enterprise is IoT. These are very distributed systems, and that's what makes the system so valuable and so vulnerable at the same time.
Wow. So based upon what you're describing, Steve, Homaira, is there really any place which is safe? Is there anything or anything that isn't vulnerable?
Ray, unfortunately, the answer is no, nothing is safe and nothing is not vulnerable. Just to put things in perspective and show how pervasive cyber impact is on all industries and the society, I'm going to cite some statistics. Cybersecurity Ventures predicts global cyber crime cost will grow by 15% annually and will reach almost 11 trillion, Ray, by 2025. Today, it is at 6 trillion, which equates to the third largest GDP in the world after the US with GDP of $21 trillion and China with GDP of $12 trillion. Cybercrime costs include, all the costs from A to Z, from damage and destruction and theft of data to stolen money to lost productivity and disrupted business operations, on and on and on. Revenues driven, the bad guys, imagine it, are driving revenues of estimated of $1.5 trillion based on Atlas VPN, which surpasses combined revenues from Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Tesla, and Microsoft in 2019, which means it's a big industry. It's a big, real industry, even though we don't like it. But it is a real industry with, people making careers out of it. I know these statistics seem terrifying, which brings me to my next point. To resolve the cybercrime phenomena, we must take many steps to combat it. One of the most important ways is to resolve the vulnerabilities of the ecosystem itself by sharing information, having a strong public-private collaboration, and making a paradigm change in the way cybersecurity providers, businesses, society, and governments protect us from and respond to this massive threat. So on the side of public-private collaboration and information sharing, a recent World Economic article by Daniel Buruso, who is global CISO of Santander, discusses the issue at hand. He reasons for three key changes. First, the community needs to raise the cost of committing cybercrime to deter the actions of threat actors. Second, an international coalition of law enforcement and governments is needed to disrupt the activities of ransomware operators and other type of hackers. And third, businesses have a key role to play and must support law enforcement agencies in their efforts to bring more criminals to justice. So you will be amazed to learn that only three in 1,000 cyber criminals are currently prosecuted. The rest are going free. So in future, we have to change in international data sharing regulations and must support collaboration across global borders instead of hindering the fight, actually. On the side of cybersecurity providers themselves, they need to increase the efficacy and interoperability of solutions that they are offering, moving from point solutions to full solutions. While each product plays a different role, they can be integrated flawlessly with each other, which is not the case today.
So, Steve, since we don't have safe places and everything is vulnerable, which isn't very encouraging, but it is the reality that we operate in. As you take a look across the landscape, what are the cyber vulnerabilities that are most concerning to you today that we should be paying attention to? And then what are some of the technologies and approaches that are being used today to help close the gap on those vulnerabilities?
Ray, great question. Let me just underscore what Homaira said about the nature of big business in cybercrime. This is an enormous business and it's a growth business. So the vulnerabilities come from lots and lots of different places as business opportunities. And there's a few I want to mention. First of all, it's impossible to write fully secure source code or software. There's no mathematical proof for source code. Second point is that we live in a world of ambient data. And again, that's what makes the internet so valuable. But ambient data is promiscuous. There's an old saying, information wants to be free. Data wants to move around, and it doesn't always want to stay where you want to keep it. And when they say free, they mean, as the open source community says, free speech, not free beer. In other words, it's not about price. It's about data moving around. The third thing a lot of organizations deal with is hardware, legacy hardware, things that are sort of kludged together, incompatible systems, old software that nobody knows exactly how it was patched. The fourth element is the economic incentives, which are missing for people to adequately invest in security. But the most important thing, and the point that I really want people to come away with, is that the fundamental vulnerability is always with the human beings in the system. The human is always the weakest link. People who use information systems, like all of us, are sloppy, they're forgetful, they're seeking convenience. They have a high risk tolerance. Sometimes they think they're more secure than the people around them in the same way that everyone thinks they're a better than average driver. And so basically 85%, 90% of the vulnerabilities in the actual attacks that have happened in the last several years are a function of human beings just doing the wrong thing. Ransomware is more than ever a result of people clicking on a phishing link. Low-tech attacks may not be technically most exciting, scientifically most interesting, but they're the ones that cyber criminals can most easily exploit, and that's usually associated with people. It's really hard to swallow that so much value could be destroyed by a person clicking on a bad link. But that's actually what happens in maybe 90% of the cyber attacks that we deal with. So to wrap back around to the question you asked about solutions, as Homaira said, it's an ecosystem problem. It's going to require ecosystem solutions. But from my perspective, the place you start is by changing the behavior of the people in your organization and the people who use your technology. The human factor, that's really, really hard because that involves human behavior. But that's where I think we've got to go.
You know, for years, we've heard about cybersecurity problems in finance and government and healthcare and other industries like that. But recently, we've had some very public and impactful cyber attacks on infrastructure. For example, the Colonial Pipeline attack that impacted the East Coast. Homaira, are the targets for cyber criminals expanding? Are transportation fleets next? And if so, why would that be?
Well, Ray, actually, there are two things happening here. First, cybersecurity attacks on all industries have gone up dramatically over the last few years, and especially in 2020, when attack surface increased dramatically during the pandemic, with companies issuing stay-at-home orders to their employees. However, when you look closely, you will see attacks on transportation as a percent of total attacks on all industries have actually gone down. As for terminology, I want to just make sure that transportation, we're defining it very broadly here, which includes ocean container shipments, air transportation, trains and subways, automotive, as well as transportation fleets and logistics. Based on IBM report, percent of attacks attributable to transportation industry made a significant downward jump in 2020, accounting only for 5% of all attacks and being in the 9th place in terms of industry, whereby it was in the 3rd place in 2019, accounting for 10% of all attacks. So this decreased might be due to a decrease in transportation use in 2020 due to the pandemic, and actually an increase in effective security controls in the industry following major attacks on FedEx and Maersk in 2017 by NotPetya malware. Both companies reported approximately $300 million net loss due to this malware. Post these attacks, a lot of transportation companies started to beef up their security posture. The reason for an overall increase of attacks in 2020 is a dramatic increase in ransomware, as Steve mentioned, which accounted for 23% of all attacks. The other two top categories were data theft, which also Steve mentioned, and server access. Ransomware is in general industry agnostic because basically no matter how big or small your operations is, if your data gets encrypted and you can't do your operations, you pay for it. But interestingly enough, in 2020, transportation wasn't on the top list in terms of ransomware. Instead, it was manufacturing, professional services, and wholesale. Three of them together accounted for 52% of all ransomware, which is huge. Now, when looking closely to transportation, 25% of attacks against transportation in 2020 involved a malicious insider or misconfiguration, which is where transportation companies should focus on. So the malicious insider, I think transportation has been less sensitive to insider threat, as Steve mentioned, being truly the most important one. Now, you mentioned the Colonial Pipeline attack. Well, hackers are increasingly focusing on vulnerabilities in industrial control systems. It used to be, you have to be a bank or healthcare to get attacked, but now the industrial control systems are quite attractive. For example, targeting these vulnerabilities increased tenfold from 52 instances in 2011 to 468 instances in 2020. Additionally, software companies are also being targeted as a gateway to their customers. We saw many examples, including SolarWinds, Microsoft, and Citrix breaches. Now, turning our attention to investment. Despite an increased spending on cybersecurity by transportation companies, they're still lagging in their spending as compared to other industries. Gartner estimates that cybersecurity only accounts for an average of 5.7% of IT spend by companies across all industries, with infotech and financial services leading the pack with 9.5% and 7.6% spent versus transportation, which is way below 5%. Again, something that must change in near future in transportation.
Well, thank you, Homaira and Steve. We appreciate you sharing your expertise and insights with us. Stay tuned for our next podcast when we'll continue our conversation with Homaira and Steve about cybersecurity. What are the methods being used to attack fleets? As vehicles get smarter and more autonomous, is that going to make it more vulnerable? And what defense mechanisms can a fleet put in place to protect itself? You've been listening to the Road Ahead podcast from Omnitracs. I hope these few minutes you've spent with us provided ideas and innovations that could transform your fleet financially, operationally, and safely. For other podcasts and information, please go to omnitracs.com. I look forward to you joining us again for our next Road Ahead podcast.